This is one of a series of interviews organized by a committee of residents of Carlton Willard Village to record and document the World War II memories of fellow village residents. I'm happy to introduce Caleb Warner here, who had a distinguished career in the U.S. Navy during World War II.
I was born in New York City in 1922 and have lived my life primarily in Cambridge, Massachusetts until I was old enough to go into work professionally. I was very fortunate to be in a prep school which was aimed a different way. When war came, I felt I had to be prepared. As a result, I changed my focus and sought some training which I thought would be useful in the war, which was marine engineering. And so after the invasion of Poland, I changed my sights and went to the University of Michigan to pick up marine engineering, which I thought could be useful in the war effort. And it also gave me the opportunity to get a commission as an ensign in the Navy immediately upon graduation.
As I recall, you spent some summers down at the Bath Iron Works working on destroyers, I think, and that must have been an interesting experience for a young guy.
Well, surprisingly enough, when I was an intern at the Bath Iron Works during my college years, that's the first time I really ran into what I would consider military action, in that the darn fool management looked at me and said, "You're a NROTC cadet. You must know how to shoot the guns of the destroyers we build." And they put me in charge of manning the guns as the destroyers, as we delivered the destroyers to the Boston Navy Yard from our shipyard in Bath. In other words, we had to go out to sea during during the time when there was considerable submarine activity on the Atlantic coast, and get that ship safely down to Boston. The Navy would not do it themselves. They would not put naval personnel aboard when they made that delivery trip. And I ended up being the gunnery officer on that destroyer, whereby I collected as many of my friends in the shipyard who had good hunting licenses and knew how to shoot a shotgun, trained them how to operate these naval guns, and we went from Bath, Maine, down to Boston Harbor, which is maybe 100 miles by sea, with these no Navy people aboard, theoretically in wartime alert. That scared me more than anything else, I think, that happened to be during the shooting war abroad. When I graduated, the next trick was to get assigned to the right end of the Navy operation to make use of my training. I had spent some time learning about not only the engineering aspects, but the design and care and feeding of naval vessels. As a result, I went to Washington and got my orders changed as a nearly knighted ensign, so that I could go aboard a repair ship. And I was the first one of my group of NROTC cadets that got overseas to a repair ship, which was wonderful.
How did you manage to wind up in the service in exactly the place you wanted to, when most of us you joined just were sent someplace without any choice?
The fact that I was able to get a slot in the Navy and exactly where I wanted to be is not exactly by chance, because going to the University of Michigan and studying marine engineering, you're connected to the technical end of the Navy pretty much automatically. For years, that university has served the Navy in ship design, the technology of ship design, and so forth. So when I needed to get my orders changed from being headed toward destroyer duty or something like that, I went down to Washington, and I was welcomed by the Navy's Bureau of Ships, that's the technical end of the Navy, to get an assignment to do exactly what I ought to be doing, which is to go aboard a repair ship. And I got the first train after I got my commission. I got my first train to Washington, and I got an audience with the top guy, or the next to top guy, in the Bureau of Ships Department of the Navy, and got the assignment. And he, in essence, looked at me and said, "Are your bags packed?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And I was off, I think, 4 days after being commissioned, to exactly what I wanted and should have had. I take my hat off to the relationship with the University of Michigan and the Navy to make that happen. I went to Scotland, where preparations for the invasion of Normandy were taking place, and had a very interesting time with that repair ship, essentially tidying up the difficulty of being impressed on our vessels as they crossed the Atlantic to deliver troops and materiel to the northern end of the United Kingdom prior to the invasion. We landed, having been there been in Scotland for about 4 months, we went down to be ready to cross the English Channel to service the invasion fleet as they actually went ashore. So we ended up on the English Channel with a repair ship moored in a way that we could get at the problems of the fleet that was assembling in the south of England. And we were one of 2 repair ships in the European theater. The other one was in the Mediterranean. We were the only one in the Atlantic, the only American repair ship. In order to get from Scotland down to where we wanted to go, we had to go around around the southwest end of England, headed up the English Channel, and we had a weird experience where we ran into a group of American vessels and troops, obviously, who were doing something, were in serious trouble, and we were told to take our ship out of there as fast as we could. There's none of our darn business what was going on. This was the so-called Exercise Tiger, in which the Allied forces were experimenting and training the troops and the vessels to handle a landing on a beach. They had selected a beach in southern England, right between Plymouth and Portland, Weymouth, to do that exercise. And we went right through it just accidentally. We didn't know it was taking place. And that particular time, there was the German E-boats that's the small torpedo craft, got at that flotilla and did a serious job sunk several of the troop carriers there. Anyway, we ended up in Portland, Weymouth, which is about as near as you can get to the Normandy beaches, the invasion beaches. We moored there about 2 months before the invasion day, and had the great privilege of being on the site garage mechanics for, I want to say, more triage doctors for that fleet that was there, readying for the invasion. Portland, Weymouth looks as if it's a miniature Cape Cod version of our Cape Cod in this coast. In other words, it was a barrier island, a rock barrier island, which of course isn't true of Cape Cod, enclosing a harbor that could contain a number of ships rather well away from the difficulties of the weather in the Channel, but very near to the Normandy beaches. And I bet you there was over 1,000 vessels there just prior to D-Day, including all the Allied vessels from all over the world, in essence. It was a fascinating place to be. Our task in the south of England was to take care of damage that had been done to the fleet prior to the invasion and get them ready for the invasion. And a lot of them had been damaged due to the fact that it had to go across the North Atlantic in rather difficult weather times. So we had a lot of structural and local damage to repair, and also to help them in any way get ready for the Normandy invasion. One of the important things that needed to be done to those LSTs was the fact they had been thought to be one-way vessels that were just merely to get troops and material to the front. Whereas the U.S. Navy and all the Allies had found they were a lot more useful than that. So we had a peculiar job of having to take off cast iron propellers that were put on these ships because of the shortage of bronze in the U.S. during the wartime. So we had the strange job of having to take the propellers off these fairly large vessels without taking them out of the water, and put the bronze propellers on so they could continue to make repeated trips to the front across the channel. And that was in many ways our most demanding job at that point. I think we must have changed the propellers to about 50 of those ships while we were down in that position, and got them ready for continued service, perhaps eventually even out in the Pacific. That part of the English Channel is pretty rough, which produced a lot of waves inside that harbor. Theoretically, we were protected, but there were a lot of waves, and for us to change propellers without taking the ships out of water, we had to go onto a platform which was over the side of our ship, and get up to the propellers right near the surface of the water. That meant we had to work with hard hat diving gear on, not scuba equipment, which meant that my whole head was enclosed in those darned cylindrical steel helmets, or bronze helmets, while working underwater, right near the surface where you're getting thrown around. And that later caused me some trouble when I was a civilian, because I had claustrophobia seriously from that issue. As far as knowing about when D-Day was going to take place, when the invasion was going to take place, we had to be the last people to know, obviously, for security reasons. And although seeing the fleet build up the way it was quite obvious it was coming. Incidentally, today is the 6th of the month, and we are honoring D-Day in remembrance today, as you may know. In the actual D-Day morning, it was obvious something serious was happening. Overhead was where the Allied planes, many of whom were towing gliders. We'd never seen gliders before. This business of taking troops in, enough troops with aircraft, was a new thing to us. Purposely, the Allies had done their glider training in other parts of Britain, so we never saw them until D-Day. They flew over us because we were a checkpoint for the aircraft to know where they are as they left British soil in order to get headed in the direction. It's a little bit like using Cape Cod as a checkpoint if you're trying to find where you are as you either approach or an aircraft approach or leave the United States. We were that checkpoint for about half the aircraft that were involved in the landing operation. And we certainly were a harbor of refuge for about a third of the ships involved. In the total number, there were over 3,000 ships involved eventually, 300 ships involved. We were involved after the invasion with servicing almost anything that needed bandage work done. We were doing triage and bandage work. The major repairs obviously had to be done by a shipyard. We couldn't do that. But there was a lot of bandaging that had to be done and triage work. So continually until the end of the war in Europe, we were there as on-the-site medics, if you were, naval medics on the coast. Regarding our knowledge of what actually was going on in the beaches, there was a real problem in getting that kind of news for security reasons. But the fact that we were in a place where many of the wounded were unloaded by ships returning to the United Kingdom, we could see an awful lot of what was going on, and it was a very frightening thing. And the only news that we were allowed to hear was what could be sent out by the British Broadcasting Company or our own overseas networks. So it was an awe-inspiring place to be, as you heard what's going on, you saw the results of what was going on, and all you were doing was applying bandages as they went by. We couldn't really handle much. We had surgical and so forth capabilities aboard, but most of the returnees had to go to the field hospitals, which were numerous, of course, in the southern part of Britain. So they went past us, but we dealt with the poor old ships that needed bandages, whereas the medical work was being done ashore primarily. We were there till within about 2 weeks of the end of the operation in Europe. At that point, by then, the ports to accommodate ships were pretty well underway back in use on the French coast, and we were less needed, so we were dispatched theoretically to go to the Pacific. But this poor old vessel that I was on was one of the more ancient in the Navy, built in 1912, they pulled us out of there, figuring we better get out, but unless some rogue attacker went after us. I don't know why, but so we were dispatched out of there 2 weeks or so before the actual termination of European operations, and we went over to Plymouth on our way home to get refitted here in the United States, but theoretically before going to the Pacific. We were actually in Plymouth, England, when the European War ended. And we went from there back to the United States, and we were in the Brooklyn Navy Yard when the war in Japan or in the Pacific finally terminated.
So that you were able to get ashore and start enjoying life again.
Well, I certainly got updated on the jazz scene when we were in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was a lot of time, and it was a glorious excursion. Unfortunately, that ship was not destined, well, didn't ever get to the Pacific. She was just too old and needed too much work to get her fitted to be of use in the Pacific. Yeah, being low speed, which is a very difficult thing when you're in the Pacific War, you need to get around fast. Being outfitted with ancient equipment, she wasn't really ready for it. So we never made it to the Pacific. I had the luck, however, of doing some rather interesting work after the Pacific Peace, getting away from that ship and getting on a destroyer that was doing, whereby we were able to do some evaluation of what a captured German submarine could accomplish in future wars. And we went to Key West and ran experimental anti-submarine warfare exercises with a captured German submarine and our modern, ultra-modern destroyer. I was the engineering officer on that, and that was a very interesting post-war experience and gave you a good window back on the technological advancements that the Germans had been able to put into their submarine fleet.
Were they very sophisticated compared to, say, a U.S. submarine?
At that time, yes. Their ability to stay underwater for longer periods of time, their speed, their armament was, I think, pretty much in advance of what we had. And you can see why they were such a threat, had been such a threat, at least in the Atlantic scene. The name of the destroyer that I was on was the USS Stribling, and that was had been built at the Bath Iron Works, where I previously had been an apprentice, and was launched just as the Japanese, as peace came in the Pacific. So she was brand new, untested, unused, and it was interesting to compare our latest destroyer against the most recent German submarine. And that German submarine came up pretty well. It's a little frightening when you think about that. Question always is what happened at Times Square in the jubilation for peacetime. And we were very lucky being in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with our poor old vessel theoretically on its way out to the Pacific. And I was in Times Square for that famous evening after the victory in Japan was being celebrated. And you're seeing recently in the press the situation of the soldier kissing the girl. I was right there when that happened. I didn't see him, but that was a place to be. There were 3 million people in Times Square at that time, that night. And it was a great experience. I was lucky enough to be there.
After all your experience, how did you feel about the cause of the war and your participation in it?
I have various opinions about that experience. It was a maturing personal experience for me. I'm very thankful for it. I luckily was allowed to be in a place where I should be, I think, thanks to the Navy allowing me to get there. It's especially difficult the 6th of this month to be thinking about that area because we're right on the Invasion Day celebration today as we're making this show. I also felt that I owed the Navy an awful lot for their helping me get through college and all that sort of thing, so I continued on in service after the war with the CIA and with the Navy for a number of years.
Well, thank you, Caleb. That was very enlightening.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.